You know New York for its skyline, its subway, its noise, and its energy that never stops. 8 million people packed into 5 boroughs. 54,000 people per square mile. The most famous city on earth. But drive 2 hours north. Drive 3 hours west. Take a road that doesn't have a name anymore. And you'll find a different New York. A silent New York. One that has been building since before the revolution. A New York made of towns that roared and burned and flooded and poisoned and disappeared. In this video, we're going to 7 abandoned towns in New York that most people have never heard of, let alone visited. Some were killed by railroads, some were killed by chemicals. One was drowned deliberately, then forgotten. And the one we're saving for last sits in the middle of New York City's own East River, surrounded by water on all sides, completely off limits to the public, and it has been haunted by the same woman for nearly 100 years. Hit subscribe. Let's go. Number 7. Tahawus, Essex County, the town that died twice. Deep in the Adirondacks, at the end of a long, rough road that climbs into the High Peaks wilderness, there's a place that has been abandoned not once, but twice. The story of Tahawus begins in 1826, when 2 men named Archibald McIntyre and David Henderson were guided through the wilderness by an Abenaki guide to a place where iron ore sat in the earth in enormous quantities. They built a blast furnace. They built a village. They named it McIntyre, then renamed it Adirondack, and for 30 years iron poured out of these mountains. But the wilderness fought back. There were no roads capable of carrying heavy iron out. There was no railroad, and the ore itself had a problem. It was contaminated with a substance called titanium dioxide, which made it nearly impossible to smelt cleanly with the technology of the era. In 1854, they built a brand new state-of-the-art blast furnace 60 feet tall, powered by the diverted flow of the Hudson River itself. 2 years later, the railroad they'd been counting on announced it couldn't cut through the mountains. No railroad, no exit, no future. The Adirondack Iron and Steel Company shut down in 1857. Everyone left. The wilderness moved back in. For 20 years, the town sat empty until a hunting club moved in, renamed it Tahawus, an Abenaki word meaning cloud splitter, and turned it into a private retreat for wealthy sportsmen from eastern cities. And then, in September of 1901, Tahawus stepped into national history. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was vacationing here with his family, hiking Mount Marcy, when a ranger found him on the mountain with a message. President William McKinley, who had been shot weeks earlier, was suddenly dying. Roosevelt descended the mountain and began a midnight ride by horse-drawn wagon through 50 miles of pitch-black Adirondack wilderness to the nearest railway station. McKinley died while Roosevelt was somewhere in the dark between the mountains and the train. Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th president of the United States because of a message delivered at this abandoned mining town in the middle of the wilderness. But Tahawus wasn't done. In 1941, National Lead Industries realized that the titanium dioxide that had made the old iron unworkable was itself enormously valuable, especially for wartime production. They reopened the mines. They built a railroad in. They built an entire new town for workers, and Tahawus was alive again for the second time. It ran until 1989, when the titanium mine closed permanently, and the last workers were transferred to a nearby town. Today, the Naughton cottage, where Roosevelt received that message in 1901, still stands, restored, preserved. The 60-foot iron blast furnace from 1854 still rises from the riverbank like something from another civilization. Most other buildings are gone. The forest has absorbed nearly everything else. Stand in Tahawus on a quiet day, and you're standing in a place that was abandoned twice by 2 different industries a century apart, and the only sound is wind through the high peaks above you. Number 6. Doodletown, Rockland County, the town Bear Mountain swallowed. Here's a ghost town hiding inside one of the most visited state parks in New York, and almost everyone who walks through it has no idea it was ever a town at all. Doodletown sits inside Bear Mountain State Park, about 45 miles north of Manhattan. The name sounds like a joke, but Doodletown was a real community. People first settled here in the late 1700s, drawn to this fold in the hills by the springs, the shelter, and the farmland along the creek. By the mid-1800s, there were families who had lived in Doodletown for generations. There was a church, a schoolhouse, a cemetery, roads that connected them to the outside world. It was never a big town, maybe 200 people, but it had had the quality of permanence, the kind of place where families buried their grandparents and expected to bury their own children someday in the same ground. Then, the state started buying land for Bear Mountain State Park. First a few acres in 1910, then more. By 1962, the park owned everything around Doodletown. The remaining residents, most of them elderly by then, were bought out one by one. The last families left in 1965. The schoolhouse stood until 1980, when it was demolished because vandals kept destroying it. Today, if you hike the Doodletown trails, you'll find over 30 numbered signs standing where buildings once stood. Each one marks a foundation, a chimney, a cellar hole in the earth. The cemetery still grows, meaning families still come to maintain the graves of ancestors who lived in this fold in the hills for 150 years before a state park decided their town was in the way. Walk through Doodletown in October when the leaves are turning, and you can almost understand why people refused to leave for as long as they did. The hills are quiet, the creek runs cold, the air smells like wood smoke that isn't there.
Number 5. Parksville, Sullivan County, the queen of the Catskills, left to rot. In the 1940s and 50s, if you were a Jewish family from New York City and you wanted a summer vacation, there was one place you went. Not the Hamptons, not the Jersey Shore. You went to the Catskills. And if you went to the Catskills, there's a good chance you passed through Parksville. The Catskill resort era was one of the most vibrant cultural moments in 20th century American history. Hundreds of hotels, bungalow colonies, and summer camps filled Sullivan County every summer with hundreds of thousands of visitors. Comedians built their careers on the stages of Catskill hotels. Families returned to the same resort year after year for decades. The Borscht Belt, as it was called, was a world unto itself, and Parksville sat at the center of it. Then came the 1960s. Air conditioning made the summers bearable in New York City. Cheap airfare opened up Florida and the Caribbean. The interstate highway system made getting out of the city faster and easier than the old mountain roads. The Catskill resort industry didn't die overnight. It bled out over 2 decades. Hotel after hotel closed. The summer crowds thinned, then disappeared. By the 1980s, the grand old hotels of Sullivan County were standing empty. Parksville today is not quite a ghost town in the traditional sense. A few hundred people still live in the area, but walk down the main street and you'll find abandoned pharmacies, empty diners, and shuttered storefronts where the summer trade sustained entire communities for a generation. The old hotels outside of town are the most haunting. Enormous wooden structures slowly collapsing back into the Catskill hillsides. Windows broken, roofs caved in, swimming pools cracked and filled with decades of leaves. Ballrooms where orchestras once played for crowds of hundreds now open to the sky. What died in Parksville wasn't just a town. It was a way of life that an entire generation of New Yorkers shared and now can never get back. There's a specific kind of grief for a place like this. Not the grief of something that failed, but the grief of something that was genuinely wonderful and simply ran out of time. Number 4. Love Canal, Niagara Falls, the town that the government built on poison. If this video is getting under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe, because what comes next makes everything before it look ordinary. This one isn't a ghost town in the way you might expect. There are no crumbling saloons here, no overgrown cemeteries, no ruins being swallowed by forest. What makes Love Canal one of the most terrifying abandoned places in New York is that it looks, from the outside, almost perfectly normal. A residential neighborhood in Niagara Falls. Quiet streets, single-family homes, a schoolyard built on top of 21,000 tons of buried chemical waste. The story begins in 1894 when a man named William T. Love started digging a canal near Niagara Falls as part of a grand scheme to build a model city powered by cheap hydroelectric energy. The project collapsed within a few years. Love ran out of money. The canal sat unfinished, a 3,000-foot ditch in the earth, and was gradually forgotten. Then, between 1942 and 1953, the Hooker Chemical Company purchased the site and began using that unfinished ditch as a chemical waste dump. For 11 years, years, they buried drums and in some cases poured directly over 21,000 tons of chemical byproducts from the manufacturing of dyes, pesticides, and synthetic rubber. At least 12 known carcinogens, including dioxin, the same chemical compound used in Agent Orange in Vietnam, all of it compressed into a 16-acre pit in the middle of Niagara Falls. In 1953, Hooker sealed the site with clay and sold the land to the Niagara Falls School Board for exactly $1. They included a brief disclaimer about the buried chemicals. The school board built an elementary school directly on top of the landfill. Homes were constructed all around it. Children played on the playground built over the drums. For 25 years, nobody looked too closely at what was underneath. Then, in the mid-1970s, after several unusually wet winters raised the water table, the drums began to corrode. The chemicals began to leach upward through the soil. Residents started finding black sludge in their basements. Children came home from school with chemical burns on their skin. The playground would fill after rain with pools of oil and chemical residue that children waded through. A reporter named Michael Brown began knocking on doors in 1977. What he found was catastrophic. Miscarriages at 5 times the normal rate. Children born with multiple birth defects. Chromosomal damage in adults. Benzene in the air of family homes at 5,000 times safe exposure levels. Brown estimated that Hooker had buried dioxin in Love Canal as much as the U.S. military had spread across Vietnam with all of its Agent Orange. President Carter declared a federal emergency in 1978, the first time in American history that a federal emergency had been declared for anything other than a natural disaster. Hundreds of families were evacuated. The school was demolished. A chain-link fence went up around the contaminated zone. Families on one side of the fence were told they were fine. Most of them were not fine. The legal battles that followed lasted decades. In the end, 1,336 former residents settled with Occidental Chemical, the company that had absorbed Hooker, for $20 million after everything they had lost: their health, their homes, their children's futures. $20 million divided by 1,336 families. Love Canal didn't just destroy a neighborhood, it changed American law. The outrage it generated drove Congress to pass the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act in 1980, better known as Superfund, creating the legal framework to hold companies responsible for toxic waste cleanup that still governs environmental law today. Today, the inner ring of the Love Canal site is still fenced off. The school is gone. Some of the outer areas were eventually declared safe and resold, though many former residents and researchers dispute that conclusion. You can drive past it. You can see the fence, the sealed earth, the signs. It looks quiet. It always looked quiet. That's the thing about Love Canal that never stops being terrifying. There was no warning sign you could see with your eyes. There was no obvious danger, just a neighborhood that looked like every other neighborhood in America, and soil that was slowly killing everyone inside it. Number 3, Kensico, Westchester County, the town they drowned for New York City's water. In the 1880s, Kensico was a real town in Westchester County, with its own railroad station, its own post office, its own community of families who had built their lives there. It had been settled since the colonial era. People were born in Kensico. They were married in Kensico. They planned to die in Kensico. Then, New York City got thirsty. As the population of New York City exploded in the late 19th century, city engineers began designing the Croton water supply system, a network of reservoirs, dams, and aqueducts to carry clean water from the Westchester Hills into the city. The Kensico Reservoir was a key component of that system, and the town of Kensico was directly in the path of the rising water. The city used eminent domain to acquire the land. Residents were compensated and told to leave. The cemeteries were carefully relocated. The graves of generations of Kensico families exhumed and moved to higher ground. The buildings were demolished or left to flood, and the water rose. Today, the Kensico Reservoir sits in the Westchester Hills, one of the largest sources of drinking water for New York City, supplying over 1 billion gallons per day to the city's taps. Every time a New Yorker fills a glass of water, there's a reasonable chance that water came from the reservoir that drowned the town of Kensico. The dam itself is a remarkable piece of engineering, a 307-foot granite structure
structure, completed in 1915, one of the most beautiful pieces of infrastructure in New York State. Tourists photograph it every year. Almost none of them know that a real town with real people and real graves is buried somewhere beneath the water behind it. Number 2. Rose Hill, Smallpox Hospital, Roosevelt Island, the ruin in the middle of the river that no one looks at. Most New Yorkers have ridden the Roosevelt Island tramway at least once, that slow, gliding cable car that gives you a bird's eye view of the East River and the Manhattan skyline. If you've ridden it and you've looked south, you've seen it, a roofless stone ruin at the southern tip of the island, its Gothic arches crumbling, its walls open to the sky. Almost nobody stops to look at it. It just sits there at the edge of the water, slowly dissolving. That building is the Smallpox Hospital, built in 1856 to isolate New York's smallpox patients on an island in the middle of the river where they couldn't infect the rest of the city. It was designed by the same architect who designed the original St. Patrick's Cathedral. It treated thousands of patients during New York's worst epidemic years. When the island eventually became Goldwater Hospital for long-term care patients in the early 20th century, the Smallpox Hospital was simply abandoned and left to the weather. The Gothic stone ruin sits within a few hundred feet of luxury apartment buildings that house thousands of people. You can walk past it on the Roosevelt Island Promenade. Most residents do walk past it every day without stopping. It's a landmark. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and it is slowly, structurally, irreversibly falling down in full view of one of the most expensive real estate markets on Earth, while nobody can agree on who is responsible for saving it.
Number 1. North Brother Island, East River, New York City. The island you cannot reach and the woman who never left it. Here's a ghost town that is not in the mountains. It's not in the countryside. It's not in some forgotten corner of upstate New York. It's sitting in the East River, less than half a mile from the South Bronx. On a clear day, you can see it from the shoreline. You can see the roofless buildings through the trees. You can see the dock, rusted and useless. You cannot go there. Access is prohibited. The island is a wildlife sanctuary. Permits to visit are issued only for scientific and academic purposes. To get there requires a boat, written permission from the city, and an escort from the Department of Parks and Recreation. North Brother Island has been abandoned since 1963. In those 60-plus years, the forest has swallowed almost everything. 25 buildings are still standing, including hospital wards, nurses' residences, staff housing in various states of structural collapse. Vines cover entire walls. Trees grow through the floors of former laboratories. The main hospital building, which once housed hundreds of patients, now has poison ivy cascading down its crumbling stairwells. This is one of the most inaccessible places in all of New York City, and it has one of the most layered, most haunting histories of any location in this state. It starts in 1885, when the city built Riverside Hospital on the island to quarantine patients with contagious diseases, typhoid, tuberculosis, yellow fever, smallpox. For decades, sick New Yorkers, most of them poor immigrants, were brought here by boat and held on an island they had no way to leave. Through the windows of their wards, they could see the city they had left. Some recovered and returned. Many didn't. Then, in 1904, North Brother Island witnessed New York City's worst disaster before September 11th. A church group from the Lower East Side had chartered a steamship called the General Slocum for a summer outing. Women and children, mostly German immigrants, headed for a picnic on Long Island Sound. The ship caught fire on the East River. The captain pushed the burning vessel toward North Brother Island, toward the hospital, thinking the doctors could help. By the time the Slocum ran aground 25 feet from shore, it was an inferno. Over 1,000 people died, most of them women and children from a single neighborhood. Hospital staff ran to the shore and pulled survivors from the water. For days afterward, bodies washed up on the island's beaches. Over 1,000 dead, burned bodies floating in the East River in plain view of the hospital. And then there is Mary. Her full name was Mary Mallon. She was an Irish immigrant who worked as a cook for wealthy families across New York City and Long Island. Between 1900 and 1907, typhoid fever broke out in household after household. Wherever she worked, an epidemiologist named George Soper tracked the pattern and reached an extraordinary conclusion. Mary Mallon was carrying typhoid fever in her body and spreading it through her cooking without any symptoms of illness herself.
herself. She was perfectly healthy, and she was unknowingly killing people. Mary didn't believe it. She had never been sick a day in her life. When Soper approached her in 1907, she grabbed a carving fork and chased him out of the kitchen. The health department sent police. After a struggle, Mary Mallon was taken to North Brother Island by force. She had broken no law. She had committed no crime. She was an immigrant with no money and no political connections, and she was being held against her will on an island in the middle of the East River because her body carried a bacterium she couldn't control and didn't believe existed. She sued the health department in 1909. She lost. She was released in 1910 on the condition that she never cook professionally again. Within 4 years, she was cooking again under a false name at the Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan. 25 new typhoid cases, 2 deaths. She was caught, returned to North Brother Island, and this time there was no release. Mary Mallon lived on North Brother Island for the next 23 years. She was given a cottage. She was allowed to walk the grounds. She eventually worked as a lab assistant at the hospital. She never accepted that she was a carrier. She never stopped insisting that she had been treated unjustly. She died on the island on November 11, 1938, of pneumonia, not typhoid, at the age of 69. She had spent 26 of her last 31 years confined to 13 acres of island in the middle of the East River. After World War II, the island served as veterans housing, then as a drug treatment facility for teenagers. In 1963, it was abandoned. The city considered turning it into a prison, a landfill, a homeless shelter. None of it happened. The island sat, and the forest grew, and the buildings fell apart, and nobody went back. Today, herons nest in the rafters of the collapsed wards where Mary Mallon once lived. The dock is rusted through. The gas-lit streets, yes, the island still has old gas-lit street infrastructure, are overgrown with vines and saplings. 25 buildings are slowly dissolving into the landscape, and somewhere on that island, under the ivy on the stone, somewhere in the crumbling walls, there is a cottage where an Irish immigrant spent decades insisting she had done nothing wrong. Whether or not she was right is a question that historians are still arguing about. What is not argued is this: Mary Mallon was held on North Brother Island against her will because she was poor, because she was an immigrant, and because the city needed someone to blame for the disease that was moving through its neighborhoods. She never left. 7 towns, 1 island you'll never be allowed to visit, 1 neighborhood poisoned by its own government, 1 town drowned so a city 50 miles away could have clean water, 1 village where 30 numbered signs stand where homes used to be, and a town in the Adirondacks that watched Teddy Roosevelt become president in the dark. New York doesn't look like a state that hides things. It's too loud, too visible, too self-assured for that. But the hiding is real. It happens in state parks and beneath reservoirs and behind chain-link fences and on islands in its own rivers. The ghost towns of New York aren't out west. They're right here. They've always been right here. And most people pass them every day without knowing what they're looking at. If this video made you see New York differently, share it with someone who needs to see it. Drop a comment and tell us which of these places you'd most want to visit. We'll see you in the next one.